Today we're going to talk about how to identify vintage from all eras that I have, which is the 1910s up into the 1980s, and we're going to look at a little vintage haul and vintage shopping. A couple of weeks ago, my friend Stephanie Canada was here. You will know her by the same name here on YouTube. And she and I went with our friend Haley Marie Vintage, who is also on YouTube, to Glenna's Vintage, which is basically a warehouse. Glenna has been collecting and selling vintage for a very long time, and she used to have a brick and mortar shop that the public could come into, but now that she is getting a little bit older and has less energy and time to spend selling vintage, she does appointments only. So we made an appointment and went to Glenna's, and it was so fun. So before we get into what I got there, let's look at the footage of shopping. Originally I was going to make this shopping bit its own video, but all three of us are so bad at filming when we're together. So I only got bits and bobs and kind of just B-roll. So first let's look at the footage that I got from Glenna's, and I can answer a few of the questions that I got while we were watching the B-roll that I took in the vintage warehouse. And then we will get into some hands-on examples of how to identify vintage. Okay, so one of the first questions that I got was, how do you go about finding so many authentic 50s clothing in sizes bigger than a triple extra small? Whenever I go hunting for vintage clothing, all 50s dresses and skirts I find have teeny tiny waists. Any thrift store I find that advertises themselves as size inclusive never has much of anything before the 70s. This question is really relevant to watching this footage of Glenna's, because here you can see me shopping through all of the racks. And I will say, even in the massive warehouse and the giant amount of stuff that Glenna has, there still were only a few things that actually fit me well. And I think it's really important to understand that I don't find a lot of vintage in person, and also that I am an easier size to find because I carry most of my weight in my lower half. I have a 36-inch waist, and like a 43-inch bust, which are on the smaller side of plus size. I can often fit like extra large. My lower half, however, is a whole different story because I wear size 18 to 20 in jeans. My hips are 52. Nothing that is a wiggle dress will ever fit me.
You're just in the background of my shot, Stephanie.
Creeping.
We found fabric.
I found fabric.
And any 1950s vintage that has a straight skirt is not going to be big enough for my hips. So that's important to keep in mind. I do a lot of shopping online. I mostly use eBay, and I also shop on Poshmark, Mercari. I will Google for like small businesses. I'll look for 1950s vintage dress like on Google and try to find small businesses that have websites. Through Instagram, I've become aware of more plus size vintage shops. But in reality, I have been the same size for about 5 years. So I have been collecting my size for 5 years at least, probably more like 6 or 7, because I would buy things that were a little too large for me throughout pregnancies. And those still fit today because as I have just my body changed, I gained weight, and then things fit differently now. So that's the biggest thing to understand, is that one, I shop a lot on eBay and Etsy and Mercari and Poshmark and just small business websites and sometimes Instagram. And secondly, I've been collecting for almost a decade. I have been collecting vintage for like 15 years, but I've been able to collect my specific size and grow my collection for at least 7 years. 5 of those I have been the same size. The other thing is that I used to be a vintage seller, and there are some things that I just kept from those days, or I would buy vintage lots, and I think just the combination of kind of knowing what I'm looking for and knowing what to search for has really led me to a lot of lucky finds. I have a budget. I don't really like to spend more than $60 on a garment unless it's something that I desperately, absolutely love. So I do have dresses that I spent $100 or more on, but in general, I try to keep it under $100 and mainly under $60. At Glenna's, I did feel lucky to find what I found. I found two dresses and a robe and a sweater, and I was so happy with those. The first time that I went to Glenna's, I believe I bought a modern reproduction dress, and I was a little bit disappointed I didn't find anything else, but my body has changed since then, and so and I don't know if maybe she's picked up more, but I was able to find what I found. So over on Instagram, I got a bunch of questions. The next question is very relevant to that last answer, and it is the best words to search for dresses, and specifically on eBay. There are 3 ways that I will search. The first one is I will just search 1950s dress and scroll through listings. I have been selling and handling vintage for so long that I can generally look at a photo and tell if it's going to fit me, especially if it's on a hanger, because I know that dresses that are around the width of the hanger will be my size or a little bit bigger. So there is that. That's the general way that I will do it, and I will make sure that the category is vintage clothing rather than just the whole of eBay, because people put up a lot of random stuff that's not actually vintage. The second thing that I will do is I will search 1950s vintage dress and then go over to view all of these sizing options and choose everything from a medium to large, because sometimes vintage sellers will say a medium to large is a 34 waist, and I can fit those often. But I will go from a large all the way up to a size 24, because some vintage tags, especially from the 50s, will be tagged a size 24, but they are actually more like a size 16, which fits me. So that's another way to do it. Then it will filter out only things that are my size. The last way that I will do it is to search 1950s vintage dress XL, because most of the time, not all of the time, and this really, really annoys me, there are some vintage sellers who will label a dress extra large when it's a 28 waist because the size says 18, and they haven't bothered to understand that modern size extra large is not a 28 waist. But for the majority of the time, an extra large will be somewhere around my size. A lot of it is clicking into a listing and going down to see the measurements, and clicking into a listing and going down to see the measurements. It's a cycle. It takes a while. Once you're more comfortable with searching and what your size looks like, it might become easier to spot the ones that are going to fit you and kind of skip over the ones that aren't. I know that if it looks very cinched, especially if they're using a mannequin, it's probably not going to be my size, because a lot of times, unless the seller's pinning the dress, I just know if it fits a standard mannequin, that's like a 28 waist, and that's nowhere near what my waist size is. How do you keep finding these epic places? I just have friends who like vintage. I didn't know about Glenna's, but Haley is really good at finding really interesting places to go. And when Haley and I went to stay in a castle, which I will link up here so that you can also see it. I don't know if I'm pointing it the right, whatever. I will link it up below. We went to Glenna's, and that was the first time either of us had been, and it was super, super fun. I believe I put a video up about Glenna's as well, so I'll link them so you can see the first time that we went. But it was really fun, and Haley has been going back at least once or twice a year, and then I just go when I can. What is a vintage warehouse? I don't actually know if it... I mean, it's a big building full of vintage. I don't know how else to explain Glenna's, and now that you've seen the footage, you will understand what I mean when I say it's a vintage warehouse. But it's massive, and I didn't even film the extra room that she has for men's folded clothing, clearance clothing, modern reproduction. I didn't even get to any of that. She has a whole separate room that's her office that is filled with hats, which you saw a little bit of. I didn't get to any of that. It's a big, big place. So if you are in the Tacoma area, definitely look her up and make an appointment. I will say that the majority of her stock runs about a 30 waist and under. So if you are plus size, I wouldn't say this is a great place to go to find plus size vintage, but it is very fun to look, and you could go for accessories. She has tons of hats, gloves, slips, nightgowns, coats, jewelry, purses, you name it, she's probably got it. Alright, so this question is a good one to lead into what I got at Glenna's, and it is what are your favorite things in vintage that modern clothes don't have. So first of all, let me show you the first, this isn't the first thing that I found, but this is a good example of things that modern garments don't have very often. Oh, come on. There we go. And it's just the details, the little things. I don't find I've never found a modern retro dress company that makes vintage dresses that have the kinds of details that vintage dresses have. For example, this is one of the dresses that I got from Glenna's. It is a 1940s dress with the button down here and then a very pleated skirt. I love that there's always like a hook and eye waist, which is really fantastic. Also, I don't think I ever have a gaping issue. I don't have a gaping issue as much anyway with vintage as I do with modern clothing. But one of the things that I really like is this little detail right here. This is a little button collar detail, which I believe it's fully removable. And you wouldn't find, like, there's a little slit and then the buttons. You don't find stuff like that in modern clothing. I don't think I've ever seen any modern reproduction, anyone, even like custom clothing. I don't think I've ever seen anyone do things like that. So that's something that I really love about vintage, is it's so much more, like, there's so much more personality and uniqueness and beauty in the construction of the garments and just the way that they fit. Because I have a very large, like, hip to waist ratio. It's like an 18-inch hip to waist ratio. A lot of vintage fits me much better than modern clothing, which will have like a 8-inch or sometimes 5-inch bust to waist ratio. Because a lot of modern clothing is made for thinner bodies, and thinner bodies don't often have as much curve to them in that way. So I like that. I also like that garments are just really structured. There's no stretch. I know a lot of people prefer stretch. I do when I want to relax, but like, as somebody who is very squishy, I really like garments that have a lot of structure to them. Now that we're talking about what I got at Glenna's, let me show you the troublemaker. This is Blueberry, by the way. She is our newest cat. We got her a year ago, and she's a pain in the butt. She's a very sweet kitty, but she's also incorrigible and very playful because she's still just a young cat. And oh my gosh, you're shedding so much. This dress is not actually a dress. It is a robe from the 1940s, and this is one of the things that I tried on at Glenna's 3 years ago when I went with Haley, and I desperately wanted it, but it was very much out of my price range at the time. And when I went this time, Glenna had actually saved it for me because she thought it looked so good that I needed it. And she also knocked the price down to something I could afford, which was so kind of her. Hello, kitty. This is a beautiful 1940s robe. I have been wanting something like this forever. I have a few 40s robes that are a similar cut, but they're just a tiny bit too small and not quite as comfortable as this. And it's got the pocket here that I really love. So this is styled by Sabery. So I just think it's really beautiful. I'm really, really happy with it. You will have seen it in some videos already because every time that I'm showing like a morning shot, I'm probably wearing this. Now, this is something that's much more, I think, specific to me and what I've been wanting. Hello, kitty. And it is a 1950s or 1940s knit sweater. I love knit sets, but they don't often come in my size more because, like, even this one is starting to get, it has a couple of moth bites in it. And sets generally just get separated. So sets are very expensive. She did say that she was pretty sure she had the skirt somewhere, so if she finds it, she will let me know. But this, it's so beautiful, and I just love it. It is 100% wool. And I just think it's really, really beautiful, and I'm so happy to have found it. And the last thing that I got is the dress that I'm wearing, which is a butterfly print 1950s dress. which I absolutely love. I do have issues with the buttons. The buttonholes are too large for the buttons, so they keep popping open, and I don't know if I'm going to replace the buttons or just make the buttonholes smaller, but it is very pretty, and I was really, really happy that this one fit because I think the print is so unique. I've never found a print like this. That's another thing I really like about vintage, is that the prints are just so much more beautiful and like more detailed and interesting and cohesive, I think, than modern garments would be. So that is what I got from Glenna's. Let's go through the rest of the Q&A on Instagram. One of the questions was, are they a pain to launder? Not really. For one, this might be a gross thing for me to admit. I don't wash my vintage dresses that often unless I have spilled on them or been really sweaty. So like my summertime garments get washed a lot more than my winter garments do. I will spot clean them. And really, if you want to be super mega careful, like there are dresses that I would never ever put in my washer. Like this one, for example, I don't think I'd put it in the washer just because the fabric doesn't seem like it would be good to launder, and I think it might be silk. It's silky. I don't know what fabric this is. It's not silk, but a lot of my cotton dresses, if they feel very crisp and sturdy, I will put them through the washer on a very gentle cycle, and then I will just line dry them. If I am too worried about the fabric falling apart, if it feels a lot softer, this is kind of where I think that just experience with handling vintage comes in. There are fabrics that I know would not hold up in the wash, and I will just put them in my tub, and I use Restoration, which is like it's kind of like OxyClean, but it's made for vintage, and it's really great at getting out stains. I will either do that or just some gentle detergent. I don't think I even use gentle detergent. I just use my regular, I use like Dawn, I think. Or Glad. I don't know what my detergent is right now, but it's really not that hard. Just the majority of the care that I do when I wash them is to put them in the tub, soak them in some detergent, give them 1 or 2 good rinses, and then what you want to do is, again, sometimes I will just throw them out on my line depending on how heavy they are. If it's a heavier garment, what you want to do is lay it in a towel flat and then roll it up to get the water out. If it's a lighter garment and it's not feeling that heavy after you've kind of gotten most of the water out of it, it's probably safe to just hang it. Tips for cleaning stains out of really, really old vintage pieces. Like I mentioned in how I launder the delicate pieces, get some Restoration. I will link it down below in my Amazon storefront for laundering. It is really great at getting out vintage stains. Do you ever feel you have enough clothes? For example, enough vests, etc.? No. Yes and no. I think I could happily live out the rest of my life never buying anything else, just from a practical / necessity point of view, and I would be fine. I have a lot of dresses. I have a lot of tops. I have a good amount of skirts. I have a lot of pants. Like, I, practically speaking, have enough clothes. But I really like fashion, and I really love vintage, and I don't know that I will ever stop buying vintage dresses, especially because I live in kind of a state of like, how do I say this? I do fluctuate my wardrobe quite often. I will reevaluate what I have in my house and how I'm wearing it pretty often. So there are things that I regret selling. There is a particular bright blue Shelton stroller floral dress that I wish I hadn't sold because I just watched an old video where I was wearing it and I was like, oh my gosh, that was so cute. Why didn't I keep that? And it's fine. I'll probably find something else that is similar, or I will message the person and be like, hey, if you ever sell this, give it back to me. No. But just from a fashion loving point of view, I feel like there's always something else that's beautiful out there. So the last few questions all had to do with how can you tell if it's vintage? How do you identify the eras? How can you tell like a 90s garment from a 50s garment? Etc., etc. I think, and then the other question was how to take your measurements which is a great question. First of all, let's talk about how to take your measurements, because this is really useful when you are shopping online. You absolutely need to know your measurements if you're looking for vintage. Most sellers will list the measurements, and if they don't, why not? So in order to know your measurements, you're obviously going to need a soft measuring tape. You can find these online, you can find them at Joann's, you can find them pretty much anywhere that sells fabrics and patterns and stuff. But first of all, you will want to do this not over clothing, over whatever undergarments you plan to wear with the things that you are going to buy. But the first measurement that you absolutely have to have is around your chest at the widest part. This will be mostly listed as a pit-to-pit measurement in a lot of vintage listings, or the chest or bust measurement, and this will ensure that it will fit you around the chest and that your buttons won't be gaping, or like sometimes the waist might fit you, but then the around the chest measurement will not. So you absolutely need to know what that measurement is. The second measurement you really need to know is the smallest part of your waist. So when you bend to the side, wherever you crease, that is your waist. That is what you need to know. It's not around your belly button. It's not around your ribs, although it could be. But your true waist measurement will be wherever you bend when you go to the side. Mine is about 36, but because I'm very squishy, I can sometimes wear a 34. And if I want it to be really comfortable, I could wear a 38 waist. And the third measurement you need to know is your hips, specifically the widest part of your hips. So this is like kind of around the widest part of your butt and legs. Or you can measure about 8 inches down, from 8 to 10 inches down from your waist. That is the measurement that most sellers will list when they are measuring a garment. I like to clarify if the skirt is not super full. I almost always have to clarify and measure 10 inches down is where I am at the widest part, and ask them what that measurement is. Most sellers, I think, do 8 inches, which is, I don't know if I just have a long like waist to hip ratio. I think I might, but those are the most important measurements that you need. You will also want to know the length from your shoulder to wherever you want the garment to hit. So I prefer things to be below the knee. So either my waist to my knee, I think I prefer the waist to hem measurement to be at least 27 inches. Or if it's shoulder to hem, it's like 45 inches or something. And then if you struggle with things fitting your arms, you will also want to measure the cuff, like where a general cuff would fit around your bicep. And then lastly, some people would measure across the shoulder, which this is something you can have somebody help you do, just because it's a little bit harder to do by yourself, but you will want to measure from one side to the other and however wide you are. If it's a garment that's like a jacket, you will need to know your shoulder to shoulder measurement just to ensure that it fits properly. Okay, and wait. Before we go anywhere else, I just want to say that if you are feeling a little bit down about the measurements of your body, if something is making you feel like you are just not worthy enough to wear the pretty thing, you tell that little voice to go right where the sun don't shine, because these numbers, they don't mean anything. All they mean is that you will better be able to find things that fit your beautiful meat sack while it is here on this earth, and they are numbers that can help you find things that make you feel joyful. Do not let your brain beat you up because of the numbers that represent the physical attributes of your body. The physical attributes of your body are wonderful and perfect, and they are exactly as they should be right now, and you're not going to let them get you down. You are so much more than the numbers of your body, whether it be the number on the scale or the number on the measuring tape. And I need you to remember that right now, whether you can find true vintage or whether you have to go to some modern vintage websites to find reproduction garments that will fit you better. You deserve to wear the beautiful thing, no matter what the numbers are. At all. Don't let your little brain talk to you like that. Don't let the numbers talk to you like that. You take those numbers, you make them behave for you in finding the things that you want, and you carry on with your life and you live your joyful little existence as a wonderful human who has numbers to represent them just like everyone else. Okay, carry on. Now let's talk about how to identify vintage. This is probably going to be the longest portion of my video because I have pulled a dress from every era that I have and as many examples of things as I want to show you so that you can be as well informed as possible. Let's look at... Okay, so the first one I'm going to show you I know the least about. I will just clarify that. However, I know the age of this garment because it belonged to my grandma. My great-grandma. Let me drink some coffee. I'm feeling a little scattered. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to show you, I think, is from around 1915. And it belonged to my great-grandma, and she made it. And I just wanted to share a few of the things that would help you identify an older garment. And it is this dress that she made herself and she wore up until I think the 1930s. And one of the things that I love is the fact that it has several length layers. So you could take these up or down because garments back then were made to be worn and worn and worn and worn. And one of the things that I would say to help you identify garments that are very, very, very old is not only the style, because obviously the style you can tell this is a teen's dress, 1910, 1915, probably somewhere in there. But also all of the closures are either hooks or snaps. A very, very old dress would not have a zipper. I don't believe they started really using zippers until about 1930s maybe. That is one of the biggest tells. If you have a garment and you are thinking it looks very, very old, other than the fabric, like this fabric is very sheer. It was made to be worn over other garments. But yeah, all of the closures are snaps or hooks and eyes or buttons. But a lot of the time, because all of the closures were meant to be hidden, it's gonna be snaps. The other thing that you can look at is I believe she French seamed every single seam on the garment because it's a sheer fabric, and so you don't want any of the edges of your seams, like the edges of the fabric, you don't want it to be visible. Hands. And also I believe this is all hand stitched. So far as I can tell, I'm not amazing at identifying whether something is a hand stitch or a machine stitch. They certainly did have machines back then. They had treadle machines. But these look like they are hand stitched because they are not a straight line. They are actually like kind of diagonal stitches, which is very interesting. Moving on into the 1920s, this is a lovely little 1920s evening gown. I will say the sun is killing me right now. I will say that this likely is meant to fit looser than it does on me, but again, with the curve of my hips in general, it's pretty hard to find like surviving garments that are my size, although they certainly do exist. I need to mend the shoulder, whoops. But this is one of the easiest tells for the 20s is the silhouette. It is very straight up and down. It is kind of just meant to hang from the chest. This one is a little bit wider in the hips. But that, as well as the pleating, again, no zippers, would not have a zipper. And here's the thing, even though I have been collecting and learning about vintage for 15 years, there are still things that I come across where I'm surprised. I used to think they would not have used elastic in the waist of a 1950s dress, and lo and behold, elastic has been used in the waistline of maternity dresses since about the 1930s. So I was wrong. However, in general, if you find a dress that has a fully elastic waist and it looks very 50s, it's most likely 70s. Because in general they did not elasticate the waistline until about the 70s. Here's a very important note. They talk about all the time how the flappers were so scandalous because they were showing off a lot more leg, but you have to understand that women in the 20s were coming out of the Edwardian era where everything was floor length. So even showing a little bit of your calf is scandalous. If you walk around or you sit or whatever, of course it's going to rise up a little bit and then you might see a flash of knee. 1920s dresses were not knee length. I want to emphasize that. Unless your girl was like an actress or a stage performer, the everyday and proper 1920s woman would not be wearing a knee-length dress. Most 1920s dresses were absolutely below the knee unless you were a performer, a stage performer, something like that. Moving on into what I think is kind of like, I am unsure. Again, I've been collecting vintage for a long time, and there are certain things that I'm still not 100% sure about. I think that this is potentially late 1930s. The detailing and the length make me think that it's either late 30s or early 40s, but because it's so straight up and down, it's kind of like straight up and down but with a waistline, and that to me says 1930s, because the waistline was coming back into fashion or whatever. But the high neckline, again, one of the things that I look at, oh, and it has a zipper in the neck, which tells me that it's probably 30s or later. I really do think this is like, it's also got a zipper in the side. This is not a dress that fits me. It used to, and I just held on to it because I really love the details. I got this from a woman whose grandmother was a stage performer from like the 1910s to the 1960s. So, this was one of her dresses. I think it's really beautiful, but I'm not 100% sure whether it's late 30s or early 40s. But I think just given the style, I think that it's early or late 30s. One of the things that I will do to become more familiar, especially if I'm not familiar with an era like the 20s and 30s, like the differences, and especially spotting the differences between the 30s and the 40s, like in the early eras, is looking at specifically fashion plates on Pinterest. So what you can do is search 1930s fashion plate, 1940s fashion plate. You could get more specific with the year, because something from 1931 is going to look different stylistically than something from 1939, and even from 1935. If you move through the 50s up into the 60s, the styles are very different. So that is a really good way to become familiar with the styles of different garments, is to look at fashion plates or to find, you know, Sears catalogs or what have you. And then you can become a little more familiar with the eras, whether it's late, early, mid-era garment. I believe that neck zippers were kind of more common in the 30s, I think, and the 40s. And then there's also a side zipper here, which is metal. Metal zippers are another tell of whether it is earlier or later. I want to say they did not really start using synthetic zippers until I believe the late 60s. I could be wrong there, but I think it was around the time that they used a lot more polyester. Because most 1950s dresses, a lot of people argue that like with the World Wars is when they stopped using metal and they started using synthetic. However, that's not true. A lot of 1950s dresses still have, the majority of them, I believe. The majority of 1950s dresses will still have a metal zipper. Synthetic zippers, I believe, didn't really become super common until the 60s and the 70s. So, I want to talk about this beautiful little dress here and how you could tell if something is vintage when it does not have a label. Other than becoming familiar with the silhouettes, the fabrics feel very different. You can also kind of tell by the construction of the garment, which is, I think some of these seams have been gone at with a pinking shear to ensure that they don't fray as much. But really, truly, you can become familiar with the silhouettes, the fabrics, the colors, is a big one. Like a 1940s dress such as this one will have a much more subtle color palette than, say, my 1960s, which I shouldn't have buried. My 1960s psychedelic robe, you know. You just become familiar. That's why I highly suggest studying fashion plates and things like that, because that is a great way to tell if it's 40s, 50s, 60s, 30s, whatever. This is a longer length, which leads me to believe that it is 40s. This one has a tag, and this is where it gets a little bit easier to identify vintage, because if you've got a tag, you can usually figure it out. First of all, the length of this dress, the silhouette is very similar, the buttons are very similar, but the length of this dress is shorter, and that's what leads me to believe this is probably early 50s. The other one is 1940s. But this has a tag and it says machine wash with care, which is a big thing in the 50s, like making machine washable dresses. It is Carrie Brook and it has a patent Sears and Roebuck and Company USA. So one thing you can do is figure out, you know, Sears and Roebuck was around for a very long time. But the USA on there is a really important tell because I believe in the 1950s, the all-American family, the American-made goods was extremely important, and a lot of garments would have USA or something like that in the label. A lot of garments also will have things like where it's made, like made in France, or even the city if it's made in New York, if it's made in California, if it's made, you know, in Canada or wherever. So those are things that you can kind of utilize to help you figure out what era, like if it's 40s or 50s, because I do believe it was the 50s, which, again, fact check me on these things because this is information that I've stored in my brain and just instinctively utilized for a long time, but it was the 50s where the all-American, you know, the all-American family, the American dream, all of that was very important, so they started to put USA or the place that it was made, the city that it was made in the label, because that was very valued at the time. Something to note about labels and tags is that the garment fabric label was not a required label to have in garments until I believe 1962, and then it was not until 1973 or 4 that the care labels were included and required. So that's a tell if a garment has a fabric. Not always. Some 1950s garments will have, you know, machine washable or like 100% cotton or something like that in the labels, but very often that is how you can tell if it's 50s or 60s or 60s or 70s, is how many labels and care tags and garment fabric fabric labels it has, because they were not required to put in the fabric content until the 1960s, and then in the 1970s you had to put in a washing care label as well. In the 1980s, again, you see the resurgence of made in the USA, and that's kind of how I often tell the difference between 80s and 90s, because again, in the 80s it was like really important that it was made in the US, and so that will often be in a garment. And the newer a garment is, the more things will be on the labels. Moving on into the 50s, I think. Here's a 1950s dress, and the 50s, in my opinion, is very, very easy to identify. Not only did you have the Made in USA, like I mentioned, the silhouette is very iconic. It's pretty easy to spot a 1950s garment because it will have a nipped-in waist and a fuller skirt, and the 50s labels will generally be very cute. I don't know how to explain it. 50s labels have a look. One of the other really important things about labels is if you find a union label, that will be the easiest way to figure out the era of a garment, because you can look up union labels. I cannot remember when they started, but they all have very specific eras. So there's like 1950 to 1962, there's 1963 to 1970, there's, you know, like I don't remember these specific eras that they have them separated into, but you can look at your union garment workers, it's a mouthful, you can look at your ILGWU tag and then cross-reference it online with the different eras of the tags, and that is a really easy way to figure out if it's what era it's from. And then that, along with the context clues of like the cut of the garment, the what's on the other labels, if there's a care tag, if there's a garment fabric content label, things like that. But of course, we love our 50s here with the nipped in waist and the fuller skirt. The back zipper, I believe in the 40s it was more common to have a side zipper, and then in the 50s the back zipper became more common, especially in formal garments. Again, at least I think that's what it is. I know that this is something that I know there's a difference, but again, I am just filming off the cuff here because I've been wanting to do this video and I just didn't have the patience to sit and Google it. But I will put it up on the screen. In one era, it was more common for the zipper to be in the side, and in another era, it was more common for it to be in the back. And I don't remember if it said the 40s was side and the 50s was back, or if it's flipped. But in formal garments, most often the zipper will be in the back, just because of the construction of the garment usually made it a lot easier to zip in the back. So, yes, that is another little context clue. Then we are going to get into the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. To me, the 60s are, again, very identifiable. I do have, let me grab it actually. All right. I have to run off very soon, so I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. This is a Shelton stroller, and it is an 18.5. The color palettes, the more familiar you get with vintage, you will kind of notice a shift in the color palettes from being kind of muted in the 40s, and then it flows into a little bit more rich toned in the 50s, and then in the 60s it becomes very like bubblegum. I'm pretty sure this is very early 60s, maybe like 1961, because again, like I said, in 1962 or 1963, again, I'm not 100% on my dates, but in the early 60s they were required to put in the garment fabric label. So this is either a like 1960, 1961 dress or very late 50s. But I think this is early 60s. Just because of the length, it's a little bit shorter than a lot of my 50s dresses. Again, talking about just the difference of an inch or two here. 40s will be much more towards your calf. 50s will be a little bit below the knee. And then 60s kind of hit the knee on me. So all of those things kind of tell me this is probably 1961, 1962. But then you get into the psychedelic era of the 60s, and here we have 100% cotton, washable, and the brand, as well as made in Japan. And this has a 1X size tag, which I have never seen before. It says 1X, and it also says 38 to 45. I've never seen that before in a 60s garment, but you can obviously tell this is 60s. The fabric is so obviously 60s, and it's got the fabric content. However, it does not have a care tag. It just says washable. And what I mean by a care tag is it will literally tell you, like, don't iron it, put it in the washer, don't put it in the dryer, etc. So that's one of the easiest ways to tell if it's 60s or 70s or 50s, is to look for the fabric tags and the care tags. I think this is so fun. But then moving on again into into the early 70s, we have this beautiful number, which you probably would guess that this is 70s just because it's such a flowy one. But here we have machine wash, warm, and tumble dry. And then it has a separate tag for the fabric content. It is acetate and nylon, and then it says made in USA, which you will find in some 70s garments. But, of course, this style, it is very early 70s. I would say this is more moving out of the 60s into the 70s, so likely 1973-ish. It hasn't quite hit the, like, more earthy hippie, although hippies were very psychedelic. And then we have two that I believe are, I think this is probably, oh, actually, there are no tags in this, so this might be, this is not homemade. The belt makes me think this is, oh, it could be homemade. Anyway, this is a dress that I thrifted, and I would say this is probably, why does it have two? What? I think this is supposed to be a necktie because it also has a belt. But I instinctively want to say this is very late 70s, but I think it might, I don't think it's homemade. It doesn't look like a homemade dress. However, late 70s or early 80s. And then we have an actual 80s. One of the tells, again, much like between the 40s and the 50s, one of the tells that you can kind of utilize is whether it's got shoulder pads. This is an 80s dress made out of very like sweater material, and it has all of the labels, all of the care tags, made in USA dress. It's like whatever, it says California petite dresses, made in the USA. It's got all of your sizing and your care tags and your fabric labels and all of that, very 80s styled, versus this one, which I think I think this is late 70s, kind of going like the cusp of the 70s and the 80s, kind of like office wear vibes, if you will. And mainly I just say that because of the colors and the style and the feel of the garment. The last thing that I want to say is in regards to sizes, because a lot of people have asked me how I know my vintage size, and I will say mostly that's just because I know the measurements, and I know that anything between a size 18 and a half to a size like 22 will fit me. Vintage sizing varies a lot. In the 40s, like the 1940s dress that I have says it's a size 46 because that's the chest measurement because it's a European dress. I don't know what the standards are for European garments and how they were labeled vintage wise, but that is just because it is a 46 bust. I assume that's what that label means. So in the 50s and the 60s, generally like a size 22 was like a size 18. I want to say you just go down 2 sizes, if I'm remembering correctly. And it really also depends on the era. I think that I fit anywhere between a size 18 and a half vintage to a size 22 vintage. And those are just varying eras between the 1950s, early 50s and the early 60s. Like the Shelton stroller dress, I believe is probably in around 1961, 1962, and it's an 18 and a half. Versus I have a size 22 dress that is from the 50s, and it is more probably of a modern size 18. Whereas the size 18 from the 60s is more like a modern 14. So you just get familiar with it, is what I'm trying to say. But that is it. I have to run off and pick up my kids from school. I hope that this video was helpful to you. I feel like I probably did not go over all of the tips and tricks that I have for finding vintage and identifying vintage and buying vintage. But I have been wanting to make this video and share the Glenna's trip with you for so long that hopefully I was able to fit in everything that I wanted to say. And hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this was encouraging if you are around my size or a little bit bigger. I promise you, I know that it is hard to find our own sizes, but it is possible. Like I said, as a vintage seller, I found several dresses that were like a 48, a 50 in the waist. Back when I was reselling, so they are possible to find, but the reason that we mostly only see tiny vintage now is that larger sizes were just worn. They were worn through, they were worn out, they were passed on, they were thrown away, they were cut down to rags, they were reused, because a lot of vintage comes from the era where you reuse and remake and repurpose things, right? They were all about not wasting things and remaking things, so a lot of old vintage just didn't survive in larger sizes because it was worn so much. And if you think even about your wardrobe today, a lot of the garments that you had when you were younger, you might have kept to pass on to somebody else, but you are most likely, most people grow a size or two, and then you wear your favorite garments to death, and then they get repurposed or thrown away, as we do. Same thing back then. That is this video. I hope that it was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed seeing everything that I got from Glenna's and learning a little bit more about how to identify vintage and different eras. And I hope that my channel can be a little bit of happiness in your day and your week and your months. And just know that I am sending you all virtual hugs and love. And I hope, as always, that wherever you are feeling safe and loved. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!